So by now you've probably either cut it out or you will cut it out soon. This is the iPad bag cover, meaning the outside of the bag. And then this is my lining. So I'm just going to set the lining aside, but they are identically cut. You're going to cut them the same exact size because later they're going to be sewn together around the top of the bag. So I'm going to just put the lining away. Also, you would have cut a flap, and that also has to be the same width as a top of the bag, but it can be any length you want. You can make a short one, you make it a wonky one, you can make a rounded one. It's your choice on the design part of the flap down there. So I'm going to set that aside. Basically, you're going to bag those two pieces like you end up bagging this one. But first we sew the pocket. Always a pocket, or many times a zipper, goes first, because while you have the bag open, you can't sew the bag shut and then get in there and try to cram a pocket. So we're going to just, since this is the same, the fabric isn't printed, I don't want to forget which is the right side. And even though they look the same, I'm going to just put a pin marking the right side. That's the personal preference. I want to make sure that I use the same right side on both pieces. That's important, like especially if you're doing a sleeve. It doesn't matter. So you should learn to mark the right side. Otherwise, you'll have two left sleeves. So here's my outer bag. And I usually use a cutting grid, not necessarily to cut it, but to lay it out. You don't have to. You can just take an ordinary ruler, which hopefully you guys got one of these grid rulers. Those are nice. And you have to put it at least, I would say 3 inches down. 2.5 is fine, but I'm talking about the pocket itself. So here's my bag. Pocket. Where are you? Oh, see, I hate when I put things weird. Okay, so this is my pocket, and I like the way it matches. The only thing that's going to show is the welt. The rest of this is going to be on the inside of my bag. So my pocket's mostly going to be hidden, but it's that welt. So I took the specific measurement from the pattern instructions, and I'm going to fold it in half. And I just crease it so that I know where my halfway point is. I already pre-marked it. So I marked a line at the crease, 1 inch in from either side, plus a 1/2 inch down. So after my fold, I simply, at the fold, drew 1 inch away from the edge, a line, and I stopped my line 1 inch from the other edge. You need this little edge on each side for room when you flip your pocket. Then I went a 1/2 inch down and I marked a second line, and then I created this rectangle. So from there, I like to take a pencil or a chalk marker. This is another thing that's optional. You could use a pin to mark it, but I like to mark that I'm putting my pocket in this direction. So I put the arrow, or if I put a pin there, because I want the arrow to be pointing to the bottom of my bag. So I've got my rectangle, and it's easy to use this thing as a guide. I'm going to go, let's go 2.5 for me. I'm going to go 2.5 inches down. Or you can go 3. Don't go much higher on this bag because you're going to sew a seam here. So if your pocket's way up here, it's going to look horrible, or you're going to cut yourself off from actually being able to use your pocket. So I've got to the top of my ruler here. This is the right side of my fabric facing up. And this is the right side of my pocket facing down. And then I have my down arrow toward the bottom of my pocket. So I'm simply going to line up right in the middle the pocket with my ruler, and nice and straight. Before I take my ruler out, I have it the same distance from each side here. So basically it's in the middle. You could measure this to make sure. Depends on how persnickety you are. I'm going to pin 2 places, the bottom of the pocket, and I'm just pinning it way out of the way so that it's not going to be in the way of my rectangle. And then I'm going to pin out of the way toward the top. I want to pin twice because I don't want my pocket to swivel around when I'm sewing it. You could even put 2 pins at the bottom if you want. So remember, these are right sides together. So what you're looking at is the wrong side of the fabric. Then I can slide my ruler out and go to the machine. Sew this rectangle. I'm going to sew it with red thread on the top and white thread on the bottom with the hay. Most of the time we use matching thread on our projects. I want to sew around the rectangle that I've marked. And this time, yeah, I'm going to look at the needle. I don't want to start at the corners though. I want to make clean corners. In other words, I want to pivot very nicely on my corner. So I don't start at the corner. I'm going to start here in the middle, anywhere where you're going to go around this rectangle. And from the back, I'm guiding a little bit. From the front, I'm just guiding as well, keeping it straight. When I get kind of close to my corner, it's okay to take the wheel and roll it toward you so that you can not overrun. So I want to get that right down on that intersection, on that corner. And now I like to count how many. Okay, that's 5. It could be 5.5. You know, I'm going to go 6. I'm not going to pay much attention to the line I drew. I went 6 stitches because I want it to be even on both sides. That's why I counted it. So now, instead of my needle going on the pencil mark I made, the edge of my foot on the inside is going to go along that pencil mark to keep it straight. So basically I'm going right next to my pencil mark. That's okay. I'm still following my pencil mark. I'm just not right on top of it. But that's because I wanted my welt to be 6 stitches apart on both sides. And I'm getting close to the end and I can see I have one more stitch. Needle down, pivot, and then 6 stitches. There's 6 and in a nice corner again. Now I'm heading where I started, which is this thread. I'm going to pass it. I'm going to stack right on top of it. Not next to it, just go right on top of it so that you have some protection there for it to, so it won't open up on you. And just cut both threads off the top. Then you go underneath and you've got 2 threads on the bottom. So now you take out your pins. And I'm going to cut this guy open. And I do have my iron on. So about the time you're going to cut it open is a good time to turn your iron on, because most of us have domestic irons where it shuts off after 10 minutes. So you might want to go and check, make sure your iron is actually still on. So I'm going to take this rectangle that I sewed, I'm going to pinch it really straight, and I'm going to snip right in the very middle of it. Just made a small snip there. Then I'm going to go, not cutting anything else, I'm just keeping it flat. I'm going to put my scissors in there and cut toward the corners, stopping about a ½ inch before. And then I'm going to, at an angle, cut all the way to the corner, dangerously close to the point you're sweating bullets, or you're sweating cutting it in half, severing it. So I didn't hit my threads, but I actually tickled them a little bit. If you accidentally cut that thread open, all you have to do, go back on the machine, start here, go around that corner again, and then get off. You don't have to do the whole thing, but you do need to secure that corner if you accidentally snipped it. So I'm going to flip it around so that I have a good direction from the other side. And again, just carefully down the center. You don't have to measure it, just eyeball it, trust your eyes, stopping before, and then clipping it really close to the the corner that I made on both sides. So this is what we have. We have seam allowances in here. So now we're going to flip the pocket to the right side. Basically, it's easy enough. Just go in there, grab it, and pull it through. Hopefully the video won't be so blurry. So this is the inside. I'm looking at the right side of my fabric, but that's actually the inside of my bag. I'm going to move this machine out of the way. So what I want to do with the iron, I want to flatten these seams. So I can go, this is the right side. of my bag. And there's my pocket. So now I'm going to form that welt, that nice square frame that we're making. So leaving everybody else here out of the way, I'm just going to push up with my iron. Ooh, what's going on? Okay, and so I just want to push on that seam with my iron a little bit, not anything else, just this seam right here, so that it gets flat. If I iron it straight down like that, I might fold that. I don't want it folded, I want it pushed away. And I put the iron aside and I flip it over and I push the other side. What I'm doing is not only pushing this pocket fabric flat, but I'm also tucking that seam allowance toward the pocket, so that the seam allowance is going to live inside. That's what makes our welt. So I hit that with the iron. So now I flip it to the wrong side and I take my pocket. There's my seam allowance that I was just pressed up. I'm going to fold that pocket over the top of that seam allowance, and it forms a little pleat here on each side. So you just kind of pull on that. Lay this down, making sure that you definitely put that seam allowance up in there. And you do the same thing with this. Put that seam allowance in there. We're covering it with a pocket. And then fold the pocket. So now you have two folds completely flat with little pleats on the end that are open. No big deal. That's supposed to happen. Before I hit this with the iron, I want to flip it over and look at my pocket. I want to make sure it's nice and straight. You can hand press it a little bit, but grab those two little pleats that you made and just flip the whole pocket. Put your hand down on it and you can see how to adjust your welt from there. There's a little bit of a corner here. It's not as square as I'd like it to be. So I'm going to reach under there, pull on that a little bit. You can also pull in this direction to get a nice square look. So what I'm looking for here is this welt for two things: for it to meet in the middle and be closed. Also, I want the two welts to be the same width as each other, not one skinny and one fat. Once I'm happy with that, even though there's little tiny puckers here in the corners, I have two chances to get rid of those. One is with the iron and the other is with the sewing machine. So I'm ironing flat, so that will stay in place. If you want, you can pin it at this point, but I don't necessarily always pin. Sometimes pins are definitely warranted. Sometimes you don't need to. It's always about your fabric. Sometimes your fabric's like, I want to be pinned. Don't do that. So it's always up to the fabric what you have to do. So I'm going to pull my machine back, taking my flattened out pocket. Nothing is folded. It's just the pocket open. My two welts are next to each other. I'm sliding it under, but I'm only going to sew underneath here. So I've slid my welt pocket under there. I'm going to pull the top layer. Whoops, don't slide it so far. Pull the top layer, which is my bag, out of the way. I grab that little corner, that's that little teeny seam allowance corner that we made as we clipped it. And you can see where you stitched. So just move the outer bag out of the way, smash the foot right on there, and only sew across that line of the original sewing of the rectangle. So straight across just that little corner that's sticking out. And it doesn't have to be backstitched. You just want to get it to flatten out. So what I've done is I have secured this little edge here so that it's not open anymore. And I'm going to go and do the same thing. Now I will explain the instructions on the iPad pattern that you have. Doesn't have this step that I'm showing you. It is an option. You don't have to do it. On the instructions, they have you turn it over on this little pleat. They have you hand stitch that together right there. That's also an option. So it's up to you. Do what feels comfortable. If you go on the internet and look for ways to make these, you'll see people doing it both ways. All of us, most of us sew differently, but it's always, you get the same. It's like we all cook differently, but you still get the same chicken soup when you're done, but it don't taste the same. It's just different. So that's the same thing. Sewing can be whatever makes you feel comfortable doing or whatever worked for you. And I like this little edge here. It just makes it feel more secure if I can sew that down. So we have one final thing to do before we shut our pocket. Check your edges, and they are nice. It happened, remember those little puckers, they came out because I made those a little bit more square by sewing those little tips inside. Now the next thing I'm going to do, and this is one part that's really important. It's all important, but I'm taking the whole pocket, flat as it is, and putting it in. And again, I'm starting in the middle, not at a corner, and I'm putting the foot down so that my needle will hit in between the two fabrics. I don't want to stitch on my welt, and I don't want to stitch on my bag. I want to stitch in the crack. So it's actually called crack stitching or ditch stitch. See, crack stitching is easier to say. Ditch stitching, which means you're stitching in the ditch or stitching in the crack. I don't know if I can get the camera down closer, but I'll try. That's a little bit better. So what I'm doing is I'm sewing, it's actually a tiny bit to the right of my welt. I don't want to stitch on top of the welt, but if I have to choose one or the other, I'm going to stitch on the bag. So basically you're stitching right next to the welt or in the crack. If it doesn't go right in the crack, stay on the bag side. And if you had matching thread, which if I had this color thread, this stitch that I'm making would disappear. It wouldn't show, but I'm using red thread. But I'm carefully traveling along that crack all the way around so that I can secure this welt, because the welt needs to be secured before you can finish the pocket. If you miss this step, you won't have a welt. Your pocket will fall down. Nobody likes falling pockets. So I backed up a little bit to get my needle down in that corner, make my pivot. And now you can sew a little bit on the side of the welt. And then line your needle up so that you can make another turn. Sometimes you have to lift up the fabric to readjust. So the needle is a little bit too far to the left, so I'm just going to pick up my work and move it to the left a little bit. I just picked it up and moved it like this to the left. It's hard to see my hands in the way. Anyway, I'm going back down, only stitching in the crack. I have a little corner that might be showing. Like I said, if we had matching thread, nobody would know, and I wouldn't tell anybody. Last corner. And then I'm going to go ahead and cross over where I started so that I don't have missing thread later. So I'll go past where I started for an inch, about an inch, so that the stacking of the threads will keep everybody in shape. And then cut off close. You want to cut your threads closely. Whoops, come on, did it cut? Yeah. If you yank on the back, it pulls that top thread through a little bit, so you don't have any sticky threads sticking out from the top. So there, I have finished my welt. Look how fast this is, guys. We don't need no stinking 3 weeks to make this. This is the hardest part. The rest of it's pretty easy. I'm just moving that out of the way for a sec. So what's going to happen now is I need to go back to my pocket on the back side. And I'm just simply going to fold this down. And two things happen. Sometimes this doesn't come out very accurately. In other words, this should have come down all the way, but it didn't. So don't force it. If it didn't come out all the way, it's just because I didn't put my welt in the right place. So I have two choices. I can, wait, let me do something really quick. My fabric is curling on me. I don't like curly fabric. Okay, so here's the pocket. This is what I'm going to close up. This is why we did this stitching all the way around here, so that this will form our welt. And we got to keep our welt there. So what happened here is a little bit short. I have two choices. I could cut this off even so that my pocket is a tiny bit smaller, or I could just go ahead and make my two edges sewn. And then when I iron it out, the seam won't be at the very bottom. It'll be up a little bit. It's up to you. But it's easier. If it's just a small amount like this, you can just trim it off. I feel like I'm not showing it right. Okay. This is very close to being the right size, so it's easier to trim, but make sure it's flat and trim this off so that when you sew your pocket, you can see what you're doing. Before I sew it, I'm trimming off the excess, which is this down here. So now all I have to do is shut my pocket. So I've got this up again. The best way to gauge how to sew it nice and flat is go ahead and flatten it out. Then you just, again, lift it open like that so that now you're only looking at the pocket. You can put a pin or two in there if you want, just to pin those two pocket pieces together. And you're going to go all the way around, moving the top part out of the way as you travel around with a sewing machine, but you can only move one side at a time. So I'm only exposing one side of the pocket. So here's my folded pocket. The edges match, and I'm starting up where I folded it down, and I'm going to do half-inch sewing, half-inch seam allowance. I'm holding onto the thread. It's under there somewhere, and I'm going to backstitch. Now I'm going to just go for it. Straight down. Move my pin. And straighten that out. And before I get to the end, I'll make a turn because I want to keep a half-inch seam allowance. So just lift it up and make your turn. Now I move the bag out of the way because I'm sewing across the bottom. Lower the foot back down and go straight. Again, end half-inch before. Lift it up and turn. Back down. And now I'm going to move the top of my bag out of the way again. And just go straight to the end. This top part is higher, which means it's a little bit bigger than the bottom part. Like I said, fabric, we can tug and pull. So I'm going to pull on that so it'll stay nice and flat. If I don't pull on it, then I'll have a bump. I'll make a pucker and I'll sew over it. So there's the pocket. So what have I got? Yay. This is a pretty good sized pocket. I don't remember if it holds, I think it holds a phone, but it's not very deep. So it's best to keep the pocket about this length. If you're making a computer bag, you can still keep the pocket this size. You don't have to make a super long pocket if you're making a laptop bag. And you are certainly welcome to make a laptop bag. But the longer you make this, the more it'll gap. If you made this really long, it's going to gap on you. So leave it this size. You're only required to make one. Another option is if you don't want a pocket on the outside of your bag at all, you could put this in the lining. It's totally fine to put it in the lining, but that would be something that it's up to you. So there's the pocket. The only part that shows is the welt part. And then it doesn't look like a very big pocket, but my whole hand fits in there. So it's a pretty good size pocket. And it's fun to make. Like I said, if you want to do a little practice version first, just so you get used to what's going on in your brain and your hands and everybody working together, you got to get your feet and your hands and your brain all on the same page. But it turned out okay. And then from there, we're going to make that bag around 3 sides like we did. And then the same thing with the flap and the lining. I won't go that far ahead of you right now. Go ahead and play around with your welt pocket and let's see what you can do. Most of the time, people are pretty quick with making this bag. It seems since we're on Sewing Lab on Zoom, it seems like people get these done a little bit faster. In the classroom, I feel like there's distractions and people are not really getting this done as quickly as possible. But since we've been on Zoom, I've had many students make both this iPad bag and a tote bag with the same type of pocket, both in the same 3 weeks, and had them both for the same deadline. You'll get your, I think it's 50 or 100 points for this iPad bag, which is different points than the points you make for projects. Those points are 300. So don't get really fancy on this bag, just make the requirement and then get fancy on another bag so that if you get more points, for example, if you make a big tote bag, you're going to get a lot more points for it than the iPad bag. So use your tote bag as a separate project and then use this bag, which is simpler, to get your points for your bag, for your iPad bag. This is a requirement that is separate from the points in the project's points. I hope that makes sense. If you look at the syllabus, it'll make sense. Questions? Are you perplexed? Did I stop recording? Oh, okay, stop.